Welcome back to the Wrestling with Words podcast. My name is Cameron. I'm a writer, an editor, and your host. Here, we talk about all things related to writing and storytelling, and the goal is to help you tell better stories while also understanding how the best stories are told. The last video that I did was on the leftovers and had to do with grief. And this had me thinking a lot about tragic protagonists and sort of why we like tragic protagonists and how we can write tragic protagonists. But before we get into some of those steps and some of the things we can do to create a tragic protagonist or to write better tragic heroes, is to look at sort of the difference between the tragic hero or the tragic protagonist and the anti-hero. As these two might seem similar, but they're actually vastly different. The easiest distinction that I've seen used when trying to break up and determine if we are going to write a tragic hero or if we're going to write an anti-hero is looking at the ending. The tragic protagonist or the tragic hero will largely end with a funeral, and the anti-hero will largely end with a wedding. This is a very, very broad way to sort of describe the difference between these two tropes. But they sort of give the framework of the difference between them. Usually for your anti-hero, you have an unlikely hero at the start. Versus the tragic hero is you have someone who probably is, generally speaking, very heroic, taking center stage as our protagonist. So you have sort of these two camps starting out, one being the unlikely hero and the other being the likely. And the big difference is sort of the change between them as we go on in our arc and in our story. By the end of the story, the anti-hero largely becomes heroic in some sort of way, whereas the tragic hero or the tragic protagonist has something go wrong. Sometimes this is not necessarily because of a bad action that they've done, but might be a fatal flaw. But again, the tragic hero starts out as somebody who you likely would think as being the hero, or the person you choose to be your hero character. Whereas the anti-hero is someone that you might not think would do anything heroic, or that you might even avoid when you ran into them. Two sort of very broad examples would be your tragic hero being someone like Wonder Woman or Superman, and then your anti-hero maybe being someone like Joel in The Last of Us, or even Geralt in The Witcher. But sort of moving on from the point and the distinction between these two characters, let's sort of talk about how we can maybe write a tragic hero or even write a tragic protagonist sort of arc. One thing that we can do to sort of facilitate this, and this definitely piggybacks off of the series that I'm currently working on over on the YouTube channel, and that is the Character Ghost or the Character Wound series. Now, the 4 character ghosts or the 4 character wounds that we can write are guilt, grievance, grief, and gravity. With guilt, we of course are dealing with some sort of hidden guilt that a character might have, whether that's an action that they did or didn't do. Grievance is usually in the realm of a revenge tale or some sort of revenge arc. The character seeking some sort of vengeance. Grief, and this is when a character is grieving the loss of something, whether that is an event or a person or some sort of object. And then gravity, and this is one that I have kind of not seen used as much, but I think doesn't necessarily get as much attention that it sort of deserves. But gravity being a decision or responsibility that is looming over them. This might manifest itself in inheritance or even responsibility of others or somebody else around them. So how can these help us create a better or more fleshed out version of our tragic protagonist? The character wound or the character ghost will likely occur during the story. Usually it's very common to have the character ghost or the character wound come up prior to the story starting or happen off screen. The example that we see in Grief in the last video that I just posted was in The Leftovers. Prior to the book starting and prior to the show starting, the trigger point in that character wound happens before the actual start of the story. Now, usually this can be, especially for our tragic hero, this can be a turning point for them in changing from their heroic ways and succumbing to something less heroic. When it comes to our tragic heroes, they, again, start out as heroic and eventually change. This doesn't necessarily have to be a negative arc, but their normal heroic doings do need to be subverted, or they need to do something that is not considered as heroic. Another thing we can add that sort of helps us understand the arc that our hero is going to go through is adding vices to sort of balance out the virtues. And again, similar to the character wound and the character ghost, these vices are something that can be developed throughout the story, as opposed to being something that they start with. Say, violence. You have someone like Batman, who is technically a bit more of an anti-hero than a traditional hero, but he does have a code or a moral principle that he isn't going to kill anyone. But let's say by the end of the story, he must kill or he must break sort of his principles. In this case, he would then become sort of a tragic hero in a way. Although he might have saved the day or done something good, he still broke his principles and he still succumbed to some of those vices as opposed to remaining virtuous. This might be synonymous with the fatal flaw, which is a common character trope that gets added into both anti-heroes and tragic heroes alike. And the fatal flaw is actually more of a prescription that you might add to the overall arc of a hero, as the fatal flaw is the flaw that eventually leads to their downfall. Say for Batman, he doesn't want to kill, or even he holds back on his violence. And in the end, someone like the Joker or some other villain sort of wins or causes more harm than him having killed or harmed someone to stop them. The fatal flaw here being the principle that they hold, which again leaves you some room for ambiguity in, is that really a flaw to uphold your principles as opposed to succumbing and breaking your principles for a greater good? And I think a clear distinction to also add about the fatal flaw is that the term fatal flaw generally implies that the character is heroic and admirable in many other ways. And even that the fatal flaw itself would perhaps be admirable within a different situation. This is, again, a very good example if we look at Batman, for instance. The fact that he doesn't kill villains means that there's a chance of them reoccurring or recoming up. Perhaps without this level of restraint and going almost gloves off would have made Gotham a more safe place. But who's to say? But the fatal flaw is also what often prevents the tragic hero from succeeding, being their downfall and ultimately providing commentary on these sorts of aspects. And the final thing that we can do in creating a tragic hero is to not complicate things too much. All we have to do, especially if we're implementing a fatal flaw, is what is the scenario in which something that is virtuous, or maybe something that is borderline virtuous, in what situation would that actually harm or be a character's downfall? There's a lot of inspiration we can draw from just looking at the 7 deadly sins or even the 7 heavenly virtues. Sometimes the simplest of story ideas or even the simplest of characters can actually lead to the most complex and interesting scenarios. This was a bit of a broad overview of this concept, and we might revisit it later or go into a little more detail, especially with the differences between the anti-hero and the tragic hero, as both of these are very interesting to me. But if you're getting value from this podcast or from this video, please consider liking and commenting, as all of these sort of help the channel out and let me know if you are getting value from them. Also, as a bit of a personal update, I am going to be out of the country next week, or maybe a week from when this goes up. But I'll be out of the country traveling for a jiu-jitsu competition that I'll be competing in. I don't know yet what day I'll be competing on, and I doubt I'll have a whole lot of time to upload a podcast or upload a video. So I'll try to get something out on the earlier end, but if I'm silent for whatever reason, that's probably why. That's sort of it for this episode. But let me know what you're wrestling with. Have you ever written a tragic hero? Or have you ever written an anti-hero for that matter? Thanks again for watching, and thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.